first of all, thank you very much to the people attending and also to our panelists for accepting our invitation in order for us to have this interesting discussion. So what we are going to be talking about is transparency and accountability in terms of oil, gas, and mining projects. They often yield large amounts of public revenue, and this can have material impact, not just on the country's economies and revenues, but also on the population if they are properly utilized. So what this requires is a high level of transparency and a high level of accountability in terms of governance and implementation of these projects to ensure that natural resources are utilized properly, they are managed fairly for the interest of the citizens. So this is why we are here having this discussion. So we will have our first panelist, who is Professor Philip Daniel. He's an honorary professor at the Center for Energy, Mineral Law and Policy here at the University of Dundee.
Thank you very much, Karen. I thought I would do some very basic things. I have worked closely both at the IMF and since on the fiscal transparency work being done there, both headquarters type work and missions in country. So first of all, let's just remind ourselves what a key source of revenue petroleum and mining revenues are for a wide range of countries. And there's just a sample. And the tall columns show percentages of GDP, the left-hand one average from 2000 to 2013, and the right-hand one average 2014 to 2016. And the absolute revenue and grants as a percent of GDP show on the right axis. So that is simply to illustrate how important these things are. Now, the IMF went through 2 rounds in fiscal affairs of fiscal transparency work, and I was fortunate to be involved in both. And here, in a very simplified form, is the whole structure of the Fiscal Transparency Code as it stands at the moment. It has a pillar on fiscal reporting, a pillar on fiscal forecasting and budgeting, a pillar on fiscal risk analysis and management, and a pillar distinct on resource revenue management. Now, of course, in working in individual countries, there's interaction between these pillars, but taking them all together, and where relevant, using the 4th pillar on natural resources, this is supposed to allow a comprehensive assessment of fiscal transparency and accountability in resource-rich countries. And I should say that this framework has been used very widely, and it's not just a developing country matter. An assessment was done in Russia, an assessment's been done in Norway, an assessment has been done in the United Kingdom, among many others that are there. You'll see that the 4th pillar there covers 4 blocks: the legal and fiscal regime, fiscal reporting, fiscal forecasts and budgets, and fiscal risk analysis and management. Now, I should stress that any assessment of fiscal transparency here is supposed to be essentially descriptive of what the situation is and leads only to recommendations about transparency. It doesn't lead necessarily, though it may incidentally, to recommendations about policy. You'll see here, and I'm just going to go through it very quickly because it is just the basics, so that you have a comprehensive view of how at least one institution looks at fiscal transparency in resource revenue management. First block concerns ownership and resource rights under a principle that government revenues from natural resource exploration and extraction activity should be collected, managed, and dispersed in an open and transparent manner. So the first block concerns really the legal regime, the ownership and resource rights. Resource rights should be clearly defined with open and transparent procedures for their allocation. I'm sure everybody will know that there are a few countries, of which the United States is perhaps the biggest, in which resource rights are frequently privately owned. But in most of the world, that's not the case, and they are owned by the state on behalf of the people. So the legal framework for resource rights should clearly define resource ownership, who holds it, the rights and obligations and responsibilities of the actors at all stages of natural resource development. Secondly, the allocation of resource rights, how are they granted to people? So resource rights are allocated through an open and transparent process. That is the standard against which we try to assess. And thirdly, that resource rights holdings are disclosed, that the government maintains an up-to-date public register of resource rights holdings. Now, I won't be going through it here, but all of these have good, better, best standards of practice, which you are able to look up on the fiscal affairs part of the IMF website. Second block concerns the mobilization of resource revenues. Resource revenue generation and collection should be governed by clear and published rules and procedures. Now, the fiscal regime for natural resources covers not only tax and royalties specially imposed, but it also may include regular taxes. It may include some aspects of pricing, such as a domestic supply obligation with a fixed price. And very importantly, of course, in parts of the industry, it may involve pricing at different stages, primary production, transportation, refining, or liquefaction, and so on. So the fiscal regime should be clear, comprehensive, and governed by law, in other words, powers under statute. Second part, of course, is resource revenue administration. That's to do with the assessment and collection of revenues under the rules of the fiscal regime. There should be clear and impartial policies and procedures for this revenue administration with regular reporting on administration activities. That's not just the quantity of revenue collected, but also information about disputes, decisions, arbitrations, and so on. The third block concerns resource revenue utilization. Resource revenues should be managed within the budget, that is the general public budget, and the macro fiscal framework, the framework of aggregate supply and demand, which government expenditure and revenue influences, in accordance with clear fiscal policy objectives. Now, many countries have natural resource revenue funds, and if they have them, they need to be operated in a consistent and transparent manner. Now, 3 points, 3 principles, if you like, fall under that. The first concerns resource revenue forecasting, which is essential for management of the budget and the economy. Resource revenue forecasts should be based on clearly disclosed assumptions and methodology, and on a time horizon consistent with fiscal policy objectives. And I should mention that those can be short, medium, and long term, and in the long term concerned perhaps with the depletion of natural resources. The integration of resource revenues into the budget, the second sub-principle there. Resource revenues should be managed through annual budgets in accordance with the fiscal policy objectives for the use of what are usually volatile and exhaustible natural resources. And those of you who perhaps attended my previous seminar or some courses at Dundee will have seen long discussion of that issue. Thirdly, on the natural resource funds themselves, the governance of any resource fund needs to be clearly defined, or sovereign wealth fund, if you like to call it that. with regular reporting on fund operations, finances, and investment performance. Then finally, there is the block on resource activity disclosure, which catches other items not there. I believe we may be hearing more about the EITI today, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And under number 1 there, the EITI activity is central. The reporting and auditing of resource revenues. They should be regularly reported and audited, and one hopes that there is complementary activity between the government budget and accounts on the one hand and schemes such as the EITI on the other. Many countries, including Uganda that Tom represents here, have natural resource corporations, which play an active commercial part in the sector. Their reporting, their resource corporations should be required to report on resource revenue payments, which are regularly reconciled with reported government receipts. And we know, of course, that can be production sharing revenue, it can be participation revenue, or it can be tax revenue. The governance of natural resource corporations, national oil companies or mineral companies, needs to be clearly defined with regular reporting on operations and finances. In some countries, these are statutory corporations with their own legislation. In other countries, and I believe the Uganda case is a point, the corporations are governed by a relationship with the government, but they're incorporated under regular company law and behave in a commercial way. And finally, the very large area of operational, social, and environmental reporting. So this requires transparency over the government reporting regularly to the public on overall sector activity and on the status of major projects, including their social and environmental aspects and impact. So there, Karen, I hope I've stayed within my 10 minutes to give a general overview of one way of looking systematically at the whole fiscal transparency set of issues and how one can group them and evaluate them. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Philip. I think we will have all our panelists present, and then we will have a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please just drop them in the chat and we will be able to share them with the panelists. Next, we will have Mr. Tom Ayebare, who is the Manager Economic and Financial Analysis at the Petroleum Authority of Uganda.
Okay, thank you, Karen, and thank you, Philip. Once again, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you're tuning in from. I hope you are safe during this trying period. And so today, I just want to touch on a few practical aspects with regards to achieving fiscal transparency. I think, as you heard from Philip, he's given a very good overview and an introduction on the aspect. And I thought I would share some of our experience as a country, as Uganda. So just as a rejoinder, as Philip has highlighted, fiscal transparency relates to the unrestricted reporting on the past, present, and future state of public finances. And it typically relates to how various governments raise, spend, and manage their public resources. Now, some of the key aspects under that include the comprehensiveness of that reporting, the clarity, the reliability, the timeliness, and the relevance. So specifically for the extractive industries, and here we're talking about petroleum, gas, and mining, it's of critical importance, given that these resources are usually managed by the state on behalf of its citizens, as is the case in Uganda, as per our constitution, and the large economic rents that the sector is able to generate. Now, for this to work in an integrated manner, it typically has to be embedded within the legal, policy, and contractual regime of that country, and these have to speak together and work in an efficient and effective manner. And just to speak on some of the key challenges, I think we might get ahead of ourselves because there are many countries where to achieve that, one, you first have to build an industry. Now, for those of us who have been lucky to be involved in the actual development of an industry from conception to a point where you have some establishment of commercial resources, it is not a simple task, and I will tell you a lot of work has to be done. And some of the key areas of focus in that work, number one, is capacity building, because you will need a lot of specialized personnel in various areas to facilitate the analysis of the industry and the resources that you have to establish your resource base. And once that has been established, you will have to go into the market and invite participants to come and partake in your sector and in your country to develop that resource, and that will transition into how you allocate those resource rights. And depending on where you are in that particular development, you might have to engage directly with some specific players at the start. As your industry progresses, you can then transition into open and fair and efficient methods of allocating rights. However, for certain areas, they have been seen to go direct, but for most of them, and I can remember off the top of my head, even countries like Norway, even Uganda ourselves, many of them had to engage directly with many of these companies first. Then you transition on to aspects with regards to how that agreed work program within your particular contract or the governing document for that sector is actually implemented, with a focus on enhancing the participation of nationals within the country, and also linking that particular sector to the broader economy to facilitate broad-based development. And also, in addition to that, how you design your various tax policy, which is usually embedded within the contracts, to raise the government revenue, and then how you would administer that over time and report that to the citizens. So now, just quickly in terms of tax policy, now this is largely and primarily concerned with the design of the fiscal regime to govern the taxation of economic activities in a specific industry or country. So it typically involves the selection and design of various fiscal tools and that fiscal framework to generate the revenue that you do require. As you had, there are very many types, and very many countries choose whichever suits them. But as we transition on from that, and part of that is the fiscal and revenue administration that deals with the implementation of that fiscal regime. And it typically involves aspects around compliance, monitoring, enforcement, taxpayer education, and provision of evidence-based feedback. Now, specifically for the extractive industries, it does generate unique policy and administrative responses and challenges. And I'll just highlight a number of them based on my own experience. Now, the first is you find that collaboration across various government ministries, departments, and agencies to share data and capacity has to be developed and has to be encouraged. Now, you'll find for a typical development project, the contracts might be negotiated by the Ministry of Energy. These are then handed over to the petroleum regulator to implement. And in doing so, there are aspects of revenue and fiscal tools that will have to be implemented by the tax body of that country in consultation with the petroleum regulator, in addition to various other institutions in charge of the environment, safety, and various other aspects. So there's a lot of collaboration that has to be done and has to be efficient and has to be controlled. And in line with that, the aspects around the definition of the mandate of the various institutions. Now, this has to be clearly delineated within the law, policy, and the fiscal framework, so that one, there's no duplication, and two, the process is seamless and efficient. In addition to that, you'll have long lead periods with very high capital costs and delayed revenue benefits. So you'll find that the typical projects will go on for anywhere between 5 to 10 years before you have any production, and even beyond that. And even when you do have production, that production can go on from anywhere between 20 to 35 years or even beyond. So you really need to have dedicated teams and continue to build capacity to ensure that the fiscal transparency that you are seeking is sustained over the project duration. Other challenges you'll find are differing fiscal tools and fiscal regimes with varying levels of complexity, depending on the various periods when the contracts were signed. So you'll find some where you have PSCs with royalties based on price, others based on volume, various other fiscal tools, and then you will even see some countries that will transition from particular fiscal regimes to others, depending on the political environment within that country. And there's so many international examples. You're looking at countries like Indonesia. I think even Norway and the UK went through such transitions. One of the last specific challenge is the multinational enterprises that are involved within the sector. And these introduce cross-boundary taxation challenges. And here you're talking about things like treaty shopping and double taxation. So lastly, my last slide as I conclude, some of the key aspects for success or to achieve efficient fiscal transparency. One, you would need alignment across your legal policy and contractual regime as a country, so that the entire process works together seamlessly and there is no break in the system. As an example, I can, let's say from Uganda, you will find that fiscal transparency is embedded in our constitution, it's embedded in our laws, and it's embedded in our regulations as well, and in our contracts. We have recently subscribed to EITI, and we look forward to generating some of our initial reports. But this entire process has taken a number of years because the various systems had to be developed, and the industry itself had to be built to a certain point where we can actually now start to report. Other aspects relate to capacity building and institutional building to facilitate the smooth implementation of that legal, policy, and contractual regime, in addition to collaboration both at the local and in an international level with continuous assessment to update on the international best practice. And lastly, you need to design your government systems and utilize them to achieve the intended fiscal transparency. So you need to plan it out way before you actually implement, such that when you start to roll it out, the process actually works. And here I'll speak to Uganda joining EITI. And the intention was to use the existing systems and reporting lines of government to facilitate that specific process. So Karen, I beg to stop there. I hope I haven't overshot my time. Thank you.
No, we are working in good time. One of the questions that we've just received in the chat actually is about EITI. EITI is the Extractives Industries Transparency Initiative, and the person is asking that does it apply to all countries or not? So I believe our next panelist, who is Mr. Edwin Warden, who is the country officer for EITI, will throw more light on this, and he will also talk about the work that EITI does in terms of transparency and accountability, and how these tools can be relevant to mobilizing the much needed domestic revenue and strengthening of institutions and country structures.
Thank you very much, Karen. And allow me to thank Philip and Tom for the very amazing presentation so far. I think my presentation, we didn't speak before, but it ends up being sort of well placed between both of the presentations that you both have had. One coming from the IMS sort of perspective, outlining some of the key areas within the transparency code, and then from a more government perspective. So I think the EITI will sort of fit really in between implementing a standard within a country context. And what I basically want to do, taking as my point of departure, is sort of sharing in a post-COVID recovery, building resilience. What are the five main frontiers that EITI is charting that might be useful sort of within this period? So I basically want to, as discussion points, I want to highlight briefly, very briefly, because we all know so much about this. So the implication of what we call the triple crisis in the sector, and then the strategic frontiers, the five areas, and then trying to sort of bring it down to how these frontiers would help to address national issues. I'll try to really be within the 10 minutes, but let's see. So just, I mean, this I would really pass through, but what basically this shows is the trajectory of events that led to what we call the triple crisis today. So the oil price crash beginning from the early 2020, going down to when the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 as a pandemic. And then moving on to when countries started sort of feeling the effects of COVID-19 within the country. So is that sort of trajectory. You see that the prices of crude sort of kept declining throughout that time. Now, the effect is basically, or the implication of this sort of trajectory has been that metals and mineral prices have been declining in the beginning of March, but then picked up very quickly. Oil prices declined really sharply, going down as much as almost negative in some context, and then beginning to sort of pick up slowly, but still below pre-COVID levels. So you see that the impact of this triple crisis, more or less, you can see it in like sort of two areas. In terms of industry, there is project delays in many countries. So you have an example of Aker Energy postponing one of their projects in Ghana, partly for reasons including COVID-19. You also see that companies that are producing have cut their projections, and also their trade companies that are involved in selling oil and gas and minerals have sort of made cuts in these production and trade deals. So you also see another example where ExxonMobil's planned a project in Mozambique has been sort of put on hold partly because of COVID-19. So industry has really felt this effect in terms of mainly profitability being reduced for industry. Then you come to governments. There's been a lot of increased spending, right? Governments would want to spend, needed to spend on the health sector in terms of the economy, providing stimulus packages to the different sectors within countries. So we've seen that. At the same time, we're also seeing declining revenues for the government. SOEs, or state-owned enterprises, have ended up also sort of taking roles on behalf of government and making certain expenditures. Communities are also not perhaps getting exactly what they deserve to get or what they want to get, because government revenues from the central level is sort of declining. And then, as Tom mentioned, there is also countries that have sovereign national funds, including Norway, Timor-Leste, and a couple of countries. You see that in some of these countries to support these stimulus packages. So declining revenues is sort of affecting the budget. So you see budget constraints for governments around these times. So what we see here in terms of this triple crisis is a COVID-19 pandemic that is overwhelming public health systems, affecting many countries. And then on the other hand, you see the oil price crash that we sort of shared the trajectory in the beginning. And then Finally, you see a decrease in demand for commodities, partly because of surge in unemployment, partly because productions have to be cut, and partly because people are basically stuck in the room and cannot move much as part of social isolation and quarantine measures. So this sort of triple crisis brings to bear one main issue, which is basically the major financial crisis that many resource-dependent countries are sharing. I've taken off one or two slides because Tom really sort of showed the importance of resource dependence for many countries and how many countries rely on this. So to highlight some of the national priorities that we see cutting across in many of our EIT implementation countries is that countries want to basically get money. Domestic resource mobilization has always been, and even more so now in a post-recovery period, been a priority. Improving investment climate has also become a priority for many countries now. And then last but not the least, with a crisis or this triple crisis comes uncertainties that often breeds mistrust that could lead to many outcomes, including conflict. So strengthening trust, building confidence has also become a priority for countries. So you hear that within this period, many stakeholders, including the IMF boss, sort of cautioning countries that do whatever you have to do now, spend the money, but make sure you keep the receipts, reiterating the importance of transparency around a time when transparency might not be given the needed attention that it deserves. So before we highlight what the transparency measures or frontiers have been sort of, or are being championed by EITI, that will be relevant. Just wanting to highlight a bit what EITI is to answer the first question. So EITI is a voluntary organization and is currently being implemented by 55 implementing countries. So no, it doesn't apply to every country, but every country is of course more than welcome to make an application to join the EITI. The EITI operates sort of a multi-stakeholder approach where government, society, and industry players come together to promote open and accountable management of the extractive sector. I'll rush through this very quickly because Tom has sort of highlighted this in his presentation. But basically what EITI covers is on the value chain from when natural resources is discovered in a country. We focus on the license project, the license and contracts awarding processes, production, looking at revenue collection, how our revenue allocated within the country, and more finally, how social and economic indicators also disclosed within the country. What we don't go into is the public benefit, the direct public benefit, because that is the point where civil society picks up the disclosures that we've made to look at it in terms of how does it benefit public within the country. So to highlight these sort of 5 frontier areas, they all sort of touch on the points that Tom and Philip have both sort of highlighted, but it's also sort of teamed up, guiding us in terms of our strategic priorities moving forward. But one of the major ones has been systematic disclosure, which is basically moving from government records from hard copies, having paper reports as part of EITI reporting, to moving to digital publication, where more or less government and companies routinely disclose EITI information through their own portals and government officials in government websites in open data formats, which are easily accessible. So eventually, by moving through this trajectory, you also end up with having to open up the system for citizens to be able to analyze data much more easily and also contribute to debates within the country. So this has become a major feature, sort of an expectation for countries to transition towards this systematic disclosure. And you've seen tremendous inputs and efforts from countries in this direction. And just to share one example here, this is an example of how a government database could look like in any country some years back. And these have been sort of transitioned. So for example, if this is a license application database, transitioning this to sort of a mining cadastre that can be easily accessed online, where you can pinpoint an exact license and find out who are the partners here, what commodity are they working with, and perhaps looking at what are the revenues that they are paying, if you can assess this. So that is one layer of that sort of information, using a cadastre that gives you a map. But digging into this, you find sort of the details that are shared here. For example, Afghanistan's mining cadastre that shows various sort of indicators and data points that is relevant for stakeholders to do this sort of analysis that you've seen an example of Norway doing, where you have basically the government cash flow from petroleum revenues being analyzed, partly because information is systematically disclosed. So that's one of the main areas we've been sort of championing. The other one has been on beneficial ownership, basically getting to know who owns and ultimately controls extractive projects within countries. Part of it is also laying emphasis on who are the politically exposed persons within who are operating mines or owning and controlling mines within specific countries. So you look at it from the company point of view, but also government and high-level stakeholders within the country. So basically, the EITI now requires countries to ensure that oil and gas mining companies that apply for or hold licenses to operate within countries disclose their beneficial owners, and that is basically the ultimate owner of a company that also sort of controls the company. And there's many ways of sort of breaking down this beneficial ownership definition, but this sort of diagram highlights an example where you have a company that is also owned by another company, that is also owned by another company, a 34% share, and then digging deep and finding who exactly is the name, the natural person behind this company. So by default, you realize that this individual plays an instrumental role in terms of ownership and control of this so-called company. The same you can find out by connecting the dots, understanding that sometimes ownership structures means that families, relatives, combine their efforts in owning sort of companies and controlling companies. Understanding these sort of connections and linkages helps citizens, benefits governments, and also it's beneficial to industry. And I'll be coming back later to sort of explain this. But here is just an example of two practical examples that Myanmar has sort of established their beneficial ownership data. UK also, through their company data, discloses beneficial ownership information. The third one is on contract transparency, very related to beneficial ownership, also under contract and licensing transparency. Here, what the EIT is basically working on is getting implementing countries to disclose the actual contracts and licenses awarded to companies. So the soft copies being uploaded on relevant portals, including any changes, addendums that are related to the contract, so that citizens, governments, and stakeholders can understand the terms of contract, because for a very long time, these have been opaque. You see some of the progresses that have been made by EIT implementing countries and companies here. I'll move very quickly to just show some examples, so for the sake of time. But here is an example from the Petroleum Commission's website in Ghana, where you can dig into one of the licensing. You can see exactly the petroleum agreement. You can click on it and download the file, but you also have details of who the partners are, what are the areas that they're drilling, what is the commodity, what is the asset, and then what's the status of operation, the fiscal terms guiding these processes. You also see here in Philippines an example of their hydrocarbon contract as part of the resource contract portal managed by the energy partner of EITI. Another area that we've been chatting a lot for a couple of years now has been on SOE transparency and commodity trading. As Philip mentioned, we see that a lot of the revenues that countries, especially in EITI implementing countries, are disclosing are coming from national oil companies who have the mandate to represent the government in terms of production operations, sometimes also involving in sales operations. And for that reason, as part of transparency and governance of SOE work, we have also been sort of charting a part in terms of commodity sales, making sure that government discloses what they receive as part of participating in the project, how much they sold, how much they got in terms of value for selling, and what were the revenues that was transferred back to the state coffers as part of this sales agreement. So you see that sort of description here in this diagram, but that is one of the main areas. And as part of this work, we've seen disclosures by, for example, Iraq, where oil sales accounts for a majority of governance revenue, where you also can sort of see in terms of what are the various revenue streams, what are the various production avenues in terms of the SOE activity in terms of production and also commodity sales. We have worked very closely with NRGI again, who is now sort of having a database on companies, and it features massive loads of data points where stakeholders can basically dig into information on SOEs and do interesting analysis. So I would encourage people, attendees, to also have a look at this NRGI NOC database. The last one here is on subnational reporting, and basically the areas where EITI has been following up in terms of disclosures. It's making sure that disclosures in terms of transfers between national and subnational entities are reported. So when national entities receive revenue streams from companies, but transfer part of it in terms of a particular a percentage to subnational entities, these are sort of tracked. So you see sometimes there's a 15% revenue sharing agreement. How are these sort of actual payments versus what is expected tracked? Another aspect is subnational payment directly from companies who pay directly to subnational governments. So for example, ground rent, surface rent in Sierra Leone, some of these payments are made directly to subnational entities following those monies. Finally, as part of CSR projects or as part of mandatory expenditures, companies perform certain social and environmental expenditures to communities directly. These are also tracked. And the idea is that communities around these times are hard felt in terms of the effects of COVID-19. They are already grappling with the health effect. Revenues coming to them are also limited. So these sort of disclosures would help them to really understand what is due them and how much they actually receive in any financial year under review. I'll try to rush through, I don't know how many minutes I have, but to sort of explain how these frontiers are helping with helping government to address national priorities that are outlined. First one being domestic resource mobilization. So by focusing on the beneficial ownership disclosures, you see that a lot of companies, a lot of governments also help in terms of reducing the risk of corruption, because the real owners of companies become known, which in previous times have often been unknown. And some owners of companies are sometimes sort of attributed to corruption risk within countries, evading taxes within certain countries, and also contributing to terrorism and conflict finances in other countries by using sort of hidden ownership structures, by using tax havens. So beneficial ownership disclosure is one of the main tools to reducing these sort of risk. And by reducing the risk associated with the financial loss of beneficial ownership not being disclosed, countries sort of gradually help to build sort of systems that keep their monies within the country, prevent losses, and mobilize revenues that are needed to build resilience and recover from the pandemic. Because around this time, these monies are extremely useful, no matter how small or big it is. Another point is that through beneficial ownership contract disclosures, getting to know who owns contracts within your country, getting to know the actual terms of the contracts, And then these systematically being disclosed, including the revenues, it helps to address one point that Tom, you mentioned about the challenge with interagency coordination, partly because of lack of information. So it strengthens the ability of tax revenue authorities to work together with other relevant government agencies to understand and sort of keep an eye on contractual obligations and also sort of beneficial owners and systematic disclosures of revenue data. And by so doing, enforcing the rules and regulations in terms of tax mobilization. And we have several examples where, for example, in Sierra Leone, prior to implementing the EITI, a lot of their sector was sort of informal. Many revenues were not being tracked. So you see in my next slide here, after part of joining EITI around this time, the amount of revenues that were being tracked and collected by the government drastically sort of improved in the country. When they got hit by the previous sort of epidemic, that is Ebola, also with commodities prices shock, the revenues came down, but it wasn't to pre-EITI levels. So you could see that it was picking up again in 2016, a very strong indication that by implementing some of these initiatives and these frontier areas, resource mobilizations become a bit more possible for countries. I have another example from Ghana, a bit more forward-looking, where there has been a controversial deal, the EJAPA deal, where government basically was working to raise finances through raising an IPO. And the valuation that was put up for how much these gold royalties were valued have been criticized by stakeholders. EITI, working in partnership with Open Oil, it has been working on a financial modeling exercise on the mining royalties, where we have also sort of come up with a conclusion that using previous figures over a period of time and also future projections, it is most likely that this valuation has been undervalued. So based on that, providing recommendations to the government to disclose its own financial models based on which these evaluations were done. It's exactly back to the point that Philip made. I'll try not to go through all of these. Maybe it can come back as part of the discussions. But these are some of the examples how these frontier areas can help with domestic resource mobilization. Another area is also improving investment climate. So we have a time where companies are being careful whether to enter into a country to invest or to make final investment decisions. So by systematically disclosing beneficial ownership information, disclosing contract information, disclosing the terms, the legal and fiscal framework within the country, you help to clarify what are the licensing plans. Is there a bidding round coming up or has it been halted? What are the registration portals that make it easy for companies to register to do business? What is the current investment environment? When these are clarified, you make it a bit more predictable and a bit more enticing for companies to have the real-time information to take decisions in terms of investment in your country. So this boosts investor confidence within countries, and it helps to improve also what we call ease of business, because you disclose a lot of information, which is one of the indicators for ease of business rankings for countries. So for many countries that are seeking to sort of boost their investment climate in a post-COVID context, these frontier EITI disclosures will be relevant for you. I would move on to the next point. Again, COVID-19 has highlighted the importance of force majeure in contracts. So we're talking about how do you disclose contracts so citizens, governments, agencies can understand the terms. And one of the key terms when these uncertain events like COVID-19 happens is under what circumstances can companies apply for force majeure. So these discussions have been ongoing in for example, Mexico and Indonesia, what is amounting to force majeure and how do government and companies work together in terms of recovering from these pandemics. The last point that I want to make is that EITI disclosures work on government, civil society, and companies coming together to work. And because of that, it builds a multi-stakeholder platform that helps to build confidence, build trust, and sustains the gains of multi-stakeholder governance within a crisis time. We all know that during these times, as I mentioned earlier, trust is something to come. It's hard to come by. Decisions are made too quickly without much consultation. People don't know what is going on. So having this sort of multi-stakeholder platform where citizens can, through civil society, influence decisions, become a very, very important platform. Also, subnational reporting around this time helps community who are affected by COVID-19 and extractive projects. It gives them information to know exactly what they deserve to get within to get from oil and gas companies, and what subnational revenues they deserve to also get from government. And by so doing, you help to build trust vertically and horizontally. So on the one hand, from citizens vertically with government and companies above, but at the same time also help to build coordination between agencies within the country. So from tax agency to anti-corruption agency, because of systematic disclosure, there's much more sort of coordination and interagency vertical trust building, working together, coordination between them. So just to bring all of this together, transparency is extremely important in a post-COVID recovery and resilience building period. The reasons are what we've highlighted here, that it helps to shine a light on extractive revenues where they are being used to prioritize in terms of health needs, stimulus packages, subnational contributions, and development thereafter. It also fosters public debate using its multi-stakeholder platforms, providing actual and real information which is needed around this time so people are not misinformed. As well, it helps to support interesting analysis such as the EJAPA royalty valuation analysis through financial modeling, and these sort of inform government decisions. And it also helps to protect civil society rights and space in this period where some government have been seen instituting laws that may be shrinking civil society space. I think I would end here, and really sorry for perhaps going overboard, and I'll welcome some questions as we discuss. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Edwin, for your presentation. We will next we will have a Q&A session. I'm seeing a few attendees with their hands up. Maybe I will ask them to say something. I know Shaz Jamaldini, if I hope I'm saying your name correctly, has a question, and I will allow you to speak so that you can ask your question.
I just need to know about EITI. Does it also do regulation in government sector? Like if Saudi Arabia joins EITI, so will it regulate Saudi Aramco or other Saudi mining industry? It's my question. It like nationalized company. Does it regulate nationalized company or just private sector?
Great. Yes, the simple answer is yes. It does regulate. Once countries join EITI, there are a couple of requirements that countries are supposed to meet. And some of these include SOE-specific, state-owned enterprise-specific requirements. These are, for example, requirement 2.6 on SOE governance in general, around the rules and regulations of SOE governance, and then requirement 4.5, particularly on the transactions between the states and the SOEs, in terms of what are the dividend policies, what are the relationship with subsidiaries, how much revenues are retrieved from SOEs. And then another aspect goes down to, for example, quasi-fiscal expenditures, where the SOEs take the role of supporting government by performing extra corporate, non-corporate sort of expenditures. So these are also reported as part of SOE-related requirements. So countries that join EITI, yes, do disclose information by the SOEs. One point to note, though, is that you have countries that have not necessarily joined EITI, but then their SOEs play a very instrumental role. So they sometimes work with EITI as part of our outreach program to do a systematic review of their own disclosures, and then offer some recommendations that will guide them moving forward before even their countries would join the EITI.
Okay, as we ease into more questions, I do personally have a question for Professor Philip. you were discussing about resource revenue management. How do you reconcile the duty to hold states and state-owned enterprises to the duty of transparency and accountability with natural resources law that allows states to have permanent sovereignty over their resources? How do you strike the balance and encourage states to embrace transparency and accountability? Because most of them, if I give an example of developing countries, view transparency and accountability as a mechanism that gets international bodies to look into their affairs, and they want to maintain their sovereignty as states. So how do you strike that balance?
That's an extremely interesting question. Personally, I think that the development of the permanent sovereignty and everything that has followed is actually completely compatible with transparency. And if you take the view, which I think I would, that sovereignty over the natural resources means for the people and for the generations to come, then it seems to me that those people and generations to come have an entitlement to information. And it seems to me that that's the strongest argument for transparency. I think what you're referring to is much more perhaps a political concern by certain elites that disclosure will interfere with the activities that they wish to undertake, whether those activities are legitimate or are not legitimate. Just one other aspect, though, is that compliance with EITI, good relations with the international institutions, as Edwin has stressed, and also Tom, all of these things not only improve public participation, but they improve the investment climate, they improve accountability, and altogether add to the efficiency of economic transactions within a country. Interestingly, when back in 20 years ago or more, when the IMF first got into fiscal transparency matters, it followed from debt crises, and it was rating agencies and bond markets that were particularly interested to see transparency reports, because there was some correlation that if you engaged in transparency practices according to good standards, then your credit rating would tend to go up. So there's a different kind of sovereignty reason why transparency and accountability make a lot of sense. You asked me a very big question, and that's a relatively small answer, but I hope that's all right.
Yes, it is. Thank you. And this question I have goes to Tom. This comes out of your presentation. You were talking about the different entities that your authority, Petroleum Authority of Uganda, deals with in terms of revenue collection to reporting and management. Where is the role for the private sector? How does the private sector step into this role of transparency and accountability when we're discussing stakeholder management? Because at the end of the day, each and every single one of us has a role to play. So how do you manage that, and how do you reconcile that?
That's a very interesting question. As you highlighted, we deal a lot with both government and private sector. And I think specifically on revenue management, the way we look at it is twofold. One, there's the aspect of development of the sector, where private sector is required to participate. And in that participation, we do get a lot of information on how the sector itself is evolving, the opportunities and the benefits before we have any revenues. Then when we transition onto a time when we have the revenues, we do have that framework under EITI, where we have the multi-sector group, where the private sector is invited to participate, to have some discourse and dialogue. And in addition to the various government requirements and accountability that we do have to the nation, where we report to the Parliament on a quarterly and annual basis. There are public reports that we do make. We do engage with the various international bodies, and there are various publications like many from the IMF are for the public record. So there's a lot of interaction that we do have. But the one thing that we do see, and that is fundamental for us as a regulator, is the participation of the private sector through national content development. We really do see that as critical, both for enhancement of the industry itself, but also enhancement of the broader economy. Thank you.
Very much. We have a question in the chat from Lloyd Matias de Silva, and this is directed to you, Edwin. She asks that despite joining the AITI, what other measures are necessary to combat corruption in resource-rich countries?
This is a very important question, because oftentimes there's a perception that by simply implementing transparency measures, it would sort of lead to accountability. But even at the EITI, we are very wary of this sort of assertion. And we often say that no, EITI is not an end in itself. It is a means to achieving a greater end, which is transparency. So what we have been seeing in terms of our experience with implementation within our countries, I want to just highlight two main issues that I always think is really relevant if EITI implementation would really lead to transparency, accountability. And that is one, a strong political commitment. Is the country where EITI has been implemented, where these disclosures are being made, do they have a genuine intention to make revenue sector information more transparent? If so, are they willing to commit the right amount of energy, resources, funding to support this initiative and these ideas? Where countries have had this strong, high-level political commitment, you've seen that EITI disclosures and recommendations that came from these disclosures actually led to policy reforms. And we have a lot of examples like that. Where there hasn't been this high-level commitment, there's a lot of recommendations in EITI reports, but they are stuck in those papers and those reports, and it doesn't lead to reforms. So I'll say political commitment, national ownership. Again, piggyback on your point on sovereignty, sort of is an instrumental part of ensuring that EITI disclosures and transparency really leads to eradicating or mitigating the risk of corruption. The last one that I want to highlight is also an enabling environment for civil society to operate. And here I'm looking at not only civil society group, but also citizens, media houses, investigative journalists. Is there a space for these organizations to review reports and do interesting analysis without being finding themselves in trouble? Can civil society meet and challenge the government on any deal, such as what civil society, I attended a civil society event in Ghana where over 100 participants from several civil society organizations meeting in a town hall, virtual town hall, criticizing various aspects of the Ijapa deal by the government of Ghana and submitting a common sort of front opinion to the government. Based on that, the government decided to hold on the deal to evaluate before it moves on to if it wants to finalize that deal. Transparency agendas to actual accountability outcomes, including addressing corruption risk. Thank you.
We have an interesting question from Emmanuel in the chat. He asks, why is there still a delay in countries reporting to EITI? For example, he says it's not possible to have the 2020 report at the moment. So how can people get information to better monitor income in real time? And he shares the same concerns I have and thoughts I'm having. Edwin mentioned that at the moment you have only 55 countries that are members to EITI. So how can we measure the impact of transparency and accountability to ensure that this information is reported in real time and it's adequate without delay, so that people can better monitor this income, as he says, that's coming in, and have be able to make more informed decisions, not just for their businesses, but even for their communities?
I guess I'm supposed to address that question. So that's actually a very good question. It's one of the challenges, if I understand your question very well, EIT is facing that part of our main reporting dates back to sort of audited financial statements, and it means that you have to go a bit back so that you can have these audited statements. It comes back to the point that both Philip and Tom have made, that you need reliable data, not just any data. So that's why we have this sort of 2-year lag in terms of disclosures. But as part of the COVID-19 measures, there has become, the EITI board has agreed on what we call flexible reporting. And here, countries are sort of allowed to have a more flexible approach of reporting where they can disclose more forward-looking elements. So in terms of current 2020 disclosures or 2021 disclosures on production and exports could be made rather than making a 2018 audited financial statement disclosures. You can make some sort of current 2020 disclosures or 2021 disclosures or even projections. And this is not necessarily to water down the essence of EITI, which is basically reconciling audited financial statements from governments and companies, but it's supposed to take into consideration what are the health risks of collecting data, what are the challenges that are facing countries, and how do you really meet these current national measures. So to answer your question, there has been considerations for this, and flexible reporting, also what we call alternative approaches to reporting, and most importantly, the point I raised about systematic disclosures of more routine, timely information by governments and companies. These are some of the ways to address the concerns that you raised. Thank you.
Okay, again, we have another interesting question from Shaz. He says that he has read that China has stopped investment to countries, African countries in particular, that have joined EITI. So how do they handle that? How do they balance their need for investment towards their minerals, towards their natural resources, and being involved in organizations like EITI that advocate for transparency and accountability?
That's a very tricky question, and I'll be happy to hear Tom and Philip's sort of also their opinion on it. But there isn't, I mean, I've read a lot of papers on EITI before and after joining, as part of joining EITI, and there isn't much sort of data or relevant sort of research linking EITI, joining EITI to decrease in investment. If anything, it has often been increase in investment climate within and FDIs within the countries. What the point that you are making, it might be that for the reason of increased transparency as part of joining EITI, it becomes a bit more difficult to rubber stamp sort of mining oil and gas projects within countries. It becomes a bit more difficult to sort of follow up on the regulatory systems, checking revenues, checking how licenses are awarded and transferred, and how sort of production data is recorded. So for all of these things, it might be that it inhibits potential investors who might not necessarily have all the right intentions or might not necessarily want to follow all these regulatory processes. It might limit their propensity to join and invest in certain countries. But the question then is it for the better or for the worse? Would you rather have a strong system that really follows well-written and well-followed regulatory systems and prevents any investment that could be detrimental to your country? Or would you open up for any investors to join? So I'll leave it to that, and perhaps I'll be happy if Philip and Tom would want to come in on this. Thank you.
Yes, and as we are preparing to draw to a close of this amazing discussion that we have been having, I would like to ask each one of you to say something as because we have essentially been talking about shifting our focus from just talking about transparency and accountability, but actually making a commitment. And you are all essentially in your presentations asking for a call to action in terms of transparency and accountability. So I would like each one of you to say something to our attendees as we draw this to a close. We will start with Philip, then Tom, and then Edwin.
Well, thank you, Karen, and thanks to Tom and Edwin for their really fascinating presentations, which is very, very good. I would just say that I think the call to action has been made. Its popularity among governments goes up and down a bit as we go on. The Western financial markets, as it were, didn't distinguish themselves during the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And that, incidentally, is one of the reasons why the IMF's fiscal transparency framework was changed, because it needed to move more towards efficient reporting. But I would say that the transparency initiatives, and in particular the EITI, but we know there are others, including the IMF's initiatives I reported on, and NRGI's own work and others. I think those have had very significant effect. And Edwin has made a lot of that clear. Particularly about contract disclosure, which I think is very, very important, because in a way, allowing an investor, whether it is a domestic company, a state company, a foreign company, allowing an investor to come in to develop your natural resources is really an aspect of public procurement. You're paying in a particular way for a service of extracting that resource. And there is a good trend towards transparency in public procurement as well. So I think Edwin's report on the number of countries that are disclosing contracts and disclosing payments shows the achievement that has been made. The last question, and incidentally, I'd love to know the source of this comment on Chinese investment. But clearly, for those countries that over now heading for 30 or more years, for those countries that have transitioned out of full state control of the economy, there's no doubt that the transparency agenda has proved more difficult, because of the history, not necessarily an unwillingness, but the structure of state sectors has made it more difficult. And perhaps that's a challenge for the future. And I'll look forward to what EITI and others are doing to support it. The great virtue of the EITI is that it brings all these three groups together, the so-called multi-stakeholder. And I think that platform and the dialogue is in many ways as useful as any of the guidelines. I think the guidelines are fantastically useful, but the fact that there's a platform for what we have to call trialogue, I suppose, rather than dialogue, is great. So I thank you for this, and I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. Thank you, Philip and Edwin, I think, for the good contributions. I think we're making progress in the right direction, but to speak practically and candidly, I think you must first build an industry before you can have any ambitions to have significant discourse on fiscal transparency. What we've seen internationally and countries that have been successful in doing so is most of the individuals who were involved in that process were shielded a lot in the initial phases from political interruption. As many of you will know, many of the developing countries are not yet politically mature with regards to some of their systems. And given that natural resources are held by the governments on behalf of their people, you would need some sort of mature systems in place to facilitate that dialogue. Now, that's a reality that we live with in many countries, and there's not, and I'm yet to see one particular recommended or standard way of going about it. So we must navigate the waters that we're in with the tools that we have. Of course, as many of us have said, the overall intention is to be as transparent, fair, and equitable as possible. However, to get there, it will take pragmatic and intentional steps that must be implemented on a daily basis. With that said, I think we are on track with such dialogues, and inevitably, the sector that we're in speaks for itself. So I think the question Edwin was trying to answer with regards to China is that you find for most contracts that are not equitable and fair, inevitably they will crumble because they cannot stand the test of time, because one of the parties will realize that the deal was not ultimately fair. So with that being said, I think as citizens, as the private sector, the role is with us to continue to push for that fiscal transparency, to ensure that whatever we are due is realized. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Edwin?
Thank you very much, Philip and Tom. I think you've made really very good points. And just to reiterate the points that we've made throughout, that we are in a crisis time, and our countries really want to recover, build resilience, and move towards sustainable development. It's also a time when there's less emphasis, actually, because there's less revenue and less resources to allocate for very important issues such as transparency. But just as to urge countries, to urge stakeholders that there are many benefits of ensuring that transparency and accountability is followed, particularly around this time when you might not have the time and resources for it. So do your best, try as much as possible to engage, to implement these transparency steps. And you would see, as we have seen with many examples from 55-year tier countries, that you would be reaping the benefits in terms of gradually mobilizing resources for development in your country, boosting investor confidence in your country, and maintaining and sustaining trust within your country, which is really, really important as countries recover and build resilience for sustainable development. So thank you very much, Karen.
Thank you very much to all of you, our panelists, and especially to you who have attended this discussion and participated and shared your insights. And we can all agree that transparency and accountability is key. It's fundamental if we want to grow our extractives industry, and each and every single one of us has a role to play, either as people in private practice, in government, in academia. Each and every single one of us has a role to play. And I'm looking forward to having more and more discussions on transparency and accountability. And thank you so much to all of you, and have a good afternoon and a good rest of your day. Thank you very much.